When the federal agents finally broke through the rusted barn door on that wind-beaten Montana farm, they had no idea they were stepping into a tomb that held the most extraordinary secret in human history. The old farmer, Thomas Weir, 79 years of solitude etched into his weathered face, had been dead for 3 days, his body discovered by a mailman who noticed the uncollected letters spilling from the box like fallen prayers. But it wasn't the death that drew the government's attention. It was the faint electromagnetic pulse that had radiated from his property the moment his heart stopped, a signal so precise and unusual that it triggered alarms in classified facilities across 2 continents. They came expecting perhaps an illegal radio transmitter, maybe a survivalist's cache of weapons, something mundane wrapped in rural paranoia. Instead, they found the entrance beneath the hay-scattered floor, a concrete staircase descending into darkness, and at the bottom, a steel door sealed with locks that seemed to whisper of desperate secrecy. When they breached that final barrier, the air that rushed out smelled of ozone and earth and something else, something that didn't belong to this world. The chamber beyond glowed with a soft amber light that seemed to emanate from the walls themselves, and in the center of that impossible room sat a crystalline console covered in symbols that hurt to look at, beautiful and alien and utterly unexplainable. But it was the journal, leather-bound, thick as a Bible, resting on a simple wooden table, that stopped them cold, because the first page bore a handwritten entry that began with words no one was prepared to read. Today, I found an angel dying in my field, and I made a choice that will define the rest of my life. The lead agent, a woman named Sarah Chen, who had spent 15 years investigating unexplained phenomena for a department that officially didn't exist, felt her hands tremble as she turned those pages under the glow of her flashlight. Thomas Weir's handwriting was careful, deliberate, the script of a man who understood he was documenting something sacred, something that might one day reshape humanity's understanding of everything. He wrote of the autumn night when the sky above his farm tore open with light, not the cold light of stars, but something warmer, almost alive, and how the thunder that followed wasn't thunder at all, but the scream of metal and energy colliding with the laws of physics. He described running through his fields, his boots heavy with mud, his breath forming clouds in the sudden cold, following the trail of scorched earth until he found the crater, still smoking, still glowing with residual heat. And there, half buried in Montana soil, was a being that shouldn't exist, humanoid but not human, its skin a shade of blue-silver that reminded him of moonlight on water, its eyes enormous and filled with something he recognized instantly as fear, as pain, as the universal language of suffering. Thomas wrote that he stood frozen, every instinct screaming at him to run, to call someone, to do anything but what he did next. And yet something deeper than instinct moved him, something that felt like the hand of God, pressing gently on his shoulder. He knelt beside the creature, this impossible visitor, and when it reached out a trembling hand, 3 fingers, too long, too delicate, he took it, and in that touch felt a current of recognition pass between them. Soul to soul, creature to creature, both children of the same vast and mysterious creator. The journal detailed how Thomas dragged the being into his barn that night, using every ounce of strength in his farmer's body, how he fashioned bandages from his own sheets and used veterinary supplies to tend to wounds that wept a silver fluid that hardened like mercury in the air. He wrote of the terror of those first hours, expecting helicopters and soldiers at any moment because the news was already erupting with reports of an unidentified craft tracked across 3 states, of a massive military mobilization, of search grids and press conferences, and the barely concealed panic of governments facing the undeniable. But Thomas Weir, lifelong bachelor, man of few words and fewer friends, made a decision in the privacy of his barn that night, a decision rooted not in logic, but in faith, in the bone-deep belief that this wounded stranger had been brought to him for a reason. He built the chamber in secret over those first frantic months, digging by hand in the hours before dawn, pouring concrete in the dead of winter, installing the steel door salvaged from a bankrupt factory, creating a sanctuary beneath the earth where a being from the stars could heal, hidden from a world that would dissect rather than understand. And in those pages, filled with sketches of alien anatomy and philosophical musings written in the margins, Sarah Chen began to understand that Thomas Weir hadn't just hidden an extraterrestrial. He had entered into a covenant, a 40-year communion that had transformed a simple farmer into the guardian of a truth that could unite or shatter everything humanity believed about itself, about God, about its place in the infinite cathedral of creation. The other agents crowded behind Sarah, their faces pale in the amber glow, as she read aloud the entry from the being's first spoken words, phonetically scrawled across the page with obvious reverence. I am Aaron. I am far from home. I am sorry to bring you into this burden, but you have shown me what we were told to look for. You have shown me grace. And beneath that, in Thomas's steady hand, a response that seemed to echo through the chamber like a prayer. Then you are welcome here, friend, for grace is all any of us have to offer in this strange and beautiful world. And if God brought you to my door, then I will not turn you away, no matter what it costs me. Sarah felt tears she didn't understand sliding down her cheeks as she closed the journal, as she looked around at the technology that shouldn't exist, at the evidence of a friendship that had defied every boundary of species and world, and she knew with absolute certainty that nothing would ever be the same, not for her, not for her team, not for the 7 billion souls who had no idea that tomorrow, when this news broke, they would wake to a universe far stranger, far more sacred, and far more full of hope than they had ever dared to imagine. The first weeks of hiding Iran were a crucible that forged Thomas Weir into someone he barely recognized, a man, living split between two worlds, the ordinary rhythms of farming above ground and the impossible reality breathing in the darkness below. He would wake before dawn, as he always had, tend to his cattle with the same calloused hands, nod to passing neighbors with the same reserved courtesy, all while his heart hammered against his ribs like a caged bird desperate to sing the truth he carried. The military search intensified with each passing day, helicopters carving geometric patterns across the Montana sky, their blades chopping the air into anxious rhythms that made his livestock skittish and his nerves raw. Roadblocks appeared on the highway 15 miles out, manned by soldiers with faces too young and eyes too hard, asking questions about lights in the sky and strange occurrences, their clipboards thick with reports from every conspiracy theorist and attention seeker within 100 miles. Thomas lied with a farmer's stoic simplicity, shaking his head, offering coffee he didn't mean, watching them drive away with relief, flooding through him like a fever breaking. But each night when he descended those concrete stairs with food and water, with fresh bandages and quiet company, the weight of his choice settled onto his shoulders with an almost physical presence, heavy and holy, like carrying a cross he hadn't built but couldn't put down. Iran would look up at him. From the cot Thomas had assembled, those enormous eyes reflecting the amber light in ways that seemed to hold entire galaxies, and Thomas would see the gratitude there, the trust, the terrible vulnerability of a being who had placed his survival in the hands of a stranger from a world not his own. And in those wordless exchanges, as Thomas cleaned, wounds that were slowly knitting themselves back together with that strange silver fluid, he felt the presence of something greater moving through the chamber, something that whispered in the silence between heartbeats that this was exactly where he was meant to be, doing exactly what God had called him to do, even if he couldn't yet understand. Why? The breakthrough came on a frozen January night, When the news showed footage of the search being officially suspended, military spokesmen standing before microphones with carefully neutral expressions, explaining that the unidentified craft had likely disintegrated upon atmospheric entry, that there was no evidence of survivors, that the investigation would continue at a lower priority. Thomas sat in his kitchen watching the television with a cup of coffee growing cold in his hands, and he felt the tension he'd been carrying for months begin to loosen, just slightly, just enough to let him breathe without that constant edge of panic. When he went down to the chamber that night, he found Aaron sitting upright for the first time, his elongated form still wrapped in blankets, but his posture stronger, more present, and when their eyes met, there was a flicker of something that might have been relief or might have been sorrow. Thomas couldn't tell which. "They have stopped looking," Aaron said, his voice still fractured by the effort of shaping human sounds, each word emerging like something being born with difficulty into an alien atmosphere. Thomas nodded, setting down the tray of soup and bread, sinking into the wooden chair he'd brought down weeks ago, suddenly exhausted in a way that went deeper than mere physical fatigue. "They think you're dead," he said quietly, and Aaron's strange, beautiful face arranged itself into what might have been a smile, or might have been something with no human equivalent. "I am dead to them," Aaron replied, "and perhaps that is mercy, for both of us, for what I must tell you, what I must share. It is not for governments or armies, it is for hearts that are still open, for souls that can still hear." Thomas felt something shift in the chamber then, a change in the quality of the air itself, as if the walls were leaning in to listen, as if creation itself was holding its breath. "Tell me," Thomas heard himself say, his voice barely a whisper, his hands folded in his lap like a child waiting for a bedtime story that he somehow knew would change everything he thought he understood about the universe and his place in it. Aaron began to speak in longer sentences now, his mastery of English expanding with each passing night, as if the language was something he was remembering rather than learning, pulling it from some deep well of universal understanding that transcended mere words. He told Thomas of his world, a place whose name translated roughly as the Garden of Second Chances, a planet orbiting a star so distant that its light would not reach Earth for another 3,000 years, a civilization that had nearly destroyed itself in ancient wars before choosing a different path, a harder path, the path of redemption through service. "We were like you once," Aaron said, his three-fingered hands gesturing in the amber light, creating shadows that danced across the chamber walls like prayers made visible. "We were violent, we were proud, we believed we were alone, and that our suffering was meaningless until we were visited by others who showed us we were part of something greater, something that your people call God, but which has as many names as there are stars in the sky." Thomas listened with his farmer's patience, his weathered face still and attentive, but inside he felt his faith, the simple Lutheran faith of his childhood, the Sunday services and memorized prayers, beginning to expand like a seed breaking open in fertile soil, its roots reaching toward depths he'd never imagined existed. Aaron spoke of Earth as a sacred place, a world seeded with life by an ancient celestial council, a sanctuary designed not by accident but by intention, a place where souls from across the cosmos could incarnate and learn the lessons of free will, of choice, of love in the face of suffering. "Your planet is a school," Aaron said softly, "and also a test, and also a gift, for here the veil between the physical and the divine is thinner than almost anywhere else. Here the presence of the Creator is woven into every atom, every breath, every act of kindness between strangers." And Thomas, who had spent his whole life working this Montana soil, who had felt the sacred in the turning of seasons and the birth of calves and the silence of winter stars, understood in that moment that everything he'd ever sensed about the holiness of creation was true, was real, was just the beginning of a truth so vast it would take lifetimes to fully comprehend. The nights that followed became a kind of catechism conducted in an underground chamber, a theology lesson taught by an alien to a farmer, but rooted in a truth that made Thomas's heart sing with recognition because it didn't contradict his faith. It fulfilled it, completed it, showed him that the God he'd worshipped in that small country church was infinitely larger and more loving than any doctrine could contain. Iran spoke of Jesus Christ with a reverence that bordered on awe, describing him not as myth or teacher, but as a being of pure light, an emissary from the highest authority in the universe, sent to Earth at a crucial moment in humanity's development to demonstrate what love looks like when it takes on flesh and walks among the suffering. "We know of him across many worlds," Aaron said, his enormous eyes reflecting something that looked like tears, though Thomas wasn't sure beings from other worlds could weep. "We call him the bridge, the one who showed the way, for his message of sacrificial love is the key that unlocks the prison of the self, the door that opens onto eternity." Thomas felt his own eyes filling as he listened, felt 40 years of quiet faith suddenly vindicated and magnified, felt the loneliness of his isolated life revealed as preparation for this exact moment, this exact conversation. "So it's all true," he whispered, his voice breaking with emotion. "Everything I believed, everything I hoped, it's real, it's not just stories, it's not just wishful thinking." And Iran reached out his strange, delicate hand and placed it on Thomas's work-worn one, and in that touch, Thomas felt a current of love so pure it seemed to flow from the very source of creation itself. And he knew with absolute certainty that he was exactly where God intended him to be, doing exactly what he was born to do, and that this being from the stars, this wounded traveler he'd sheltered at such risk, was not a contradiction to his faith, but its confirmation, its flowering, its promise that the universe was far more full of grace than he'd ever dared to dream. The first time Aaron showed Thomas what he called the memory of light, the farmer thought he might be dying, thought perhaps his heart had finally given out from the strain of all these months of secrecy and fear, because the chamber around him dissolved into something that couldn't exist and yet was more real than anything he'd ever experienced. Iran had been growing stronger each week, his silver blood knitting his wounds into patterns that looked less like scars and more like sacred geometry. And on this particular evening in early spring, when the Montana earth above was just beginning to thaw, he'd asked Thomas to sit close, to place his hand on the crystalline device that hummed softly in the corner where it had been quietly healing alongside its keeper. "I want to show you what I see when I look at your world," Aaron said, his voice now fluid and clear, carrying harmonics that seemed to resonate in Thomas's chest like the lowest notes of a pipe organ. "I want you to understand why Earth matters so much, why beings like me cross impossible distances to protect it, why your existence here is not random, but holy." Thomas had nodded, his weathered hand trembling slightly as he touched the warm surface of the device, and then the concrete walls vanished, and he was standing in a place that was both nowhere and everywhere, suspended in a darkness that wasn't empty, but full, pregnant with potential, alive with a presence so vast and loving that he fell to his knees even though he had no body, even though he was pure consciousness floating in an ocean of divine light. He saw Earth then, as Iran saw it, not as a blue marble spinning in void, but as a jewel of incomprehensible value, a world wrapped in layers of light that pulsed with the prayers of billions, with every act of kindness, every sacrifice, every moment of forgiveness, creating ripples of luminescence that spread outward into the cosmos like songs sung in a cathedral of stars. And he understood with a clarity that shattered and remade him that his planet was being watched, protected, cherished by intelligences beyond counting, that humanity's struggle toward the light was not a lonely endeavor, but part of a cosmic drama in which the fate of countless souls hung in the balance, and that the God he'd worshipped in his simple way was orchestrating a symphony of redemption that included not just Earth, but galaxies beyond measure, all of it held together by love, by the same love that had brought a dying alien to his barn and a lonely farmer to the most important choice of his life. When Thomas returned to himself, he was weeping, his face pressed against the cold concrete floor of the chamber, his body shaking with sobs that came from a place deeper than grief, a place where joy and sorrow become the same thing because both are responses to beauty too great to bear. Iran was beside him, one slender hand resting gently on his shoulder, and Thomas could feel the compassion radiating from the being like heat from a fire, wordless and complete. "I'm sorry," Thomas gasped, trying to compose himself, feeling foolish and exposed, but Aaron made a sound that might have been laughter or might have been something closer to singing. "Do not apologize for tears that honor truth," Aaron said softly, helping Thomas back into his chair with surprising strength. "Your kind were made to feel deeply. It is one of your greatest gifts, one of the reasons this world was chosen as a sanctuary." Thomas wiped his eyes with the back of his hand, his breathing slowly steadying. But everything in the chamber looked different now, sharper somehow, more present, as if he'd been living his whole life slightly out of focus and had suddenly been given glasses that revealed reality in its full intensity. "Why me?" he asked, the question that had haunted him since the beginning finally finding voice. "Why did you crash here on my land? Why did God bring you to someone like me? I'm nobody. I'm just a farmer who couldn't even keep his own family together." The words came out raw and wounded, carrying decades of loneliness and self-doubt. And Duran's large eyes seemed to hold all of Thomas's pain without flinching, without judgment. "You were chosen because your heart remained open when others closed theirs," Iran replied, his voice carrying that strange harmonics that made every word feel like it was being spoken directly into Thomas's soul. "Because you still believed that creation was good even when your own life felt broken, because you were capable of seeing a wounded stranger and responding not with fear, but with mercy. And mercy, dear Thomas, is the language God speaks most fluently." In the weeks that followed, Thomas began to understand that his isolation had been a kind of preparation, that every lonely year, in this remote corner of Montana, had been stripping away the distractions that keep most people from hearing the deeper frequencies of existence, tuning him like an instrument for this exact purpose. Aaron taught him to see the connections between all things, how every action ripples outward in ways both physical and spiritual, how the decision to help rather than harm, to shelter rather than expose, to love rather than fear, creates actual changes in the fabric of reality itself, brightening the light that surrounds Earth and strengthening the protection that beings like him work to maintain. "Your Jesus understood this perfectly," Aaron said one night, his voice full of something that sounded like longing. "He showed your kind that the kingdom of heaven is not a distant place, but a present reality that you enter through acts of self-giving love, through the choice to see the sacred in every person, every creature, every moment." Thomas listened with the attention of a man who knows he's being taught secrets that most humans never hear, secrets that don't contradict the simple faith of his childhood, but reveal it as the seed from which an infinite tree grows. He thought of the Christ he'd learned about in Sunday school, the man who washed feet and healed lepers and forgave executioners, and he saw now that those weren't just moral examples, but demonstrations of how the universe actually works, how love is not merely an emotion, but a force, a power, the fundamental energy that holds all of creation in existence. And sitting there in that underground chamber with an alien who spoke of Jesus with tears in his enormous eyes, Thomas felt his own faith deepen and expand until it could hold both the cross and the cosmos, both the country church and the infinite temple of stars, both the particular and the universal, all of it somehow the same truth expressed in different languages, all of it pointing toward a God whose love was so vast it required multiple worlds and countless lifetimes, and visitors from distant stars to even begin to comprehend its fullness. The night Thomas finally understood the full weight of what Iran had revealed, he climbed the stairs from the chamber and walked out into the spring darkness, standing in his barnyard, with his face turned toward the sky, seeing the stars not as distant lights, but as homes, as fellow travelers, as brothers and sisters in a cosmic family he'd never known existed, but had somehow always sensed in his deepest prayers. The Montana wind carried the smell of thawing earth and new grass, and he felt the presence of God in it more powerfully than ever before, felt it not as something separate from the universe, but as the living consciousness that animated every particle of creation, from the smallest atom to the largest galaxy. He thought of all the years he'd spent feeling abandoned, feeling forgotten, wondering if his life had any meaning beyond the daily struggle to survive, and he saw now that he'd never been alone, that he'd been held all along in a love so vast and patient it could wait decades for him to be ready to receive what was being offered. "Thank you," he whispered to the stars, to the God who made them, to the mystery that had brought an alien to his barn and given him a purpose greater than anything he'd imagined possible. "Thank you for trusting me with this, for letting me be part of something holy." And in the silence that followed, in the space between heartbeats where the physical and spiritual worlds touch, Thomas Weir felt an answer, not in words, but in a warmth that spread through his chest like sunrise, a confirmation that he was seen, that he was known, that his choice to show mercy to a stranger had created ripples in the light that surrounded Earth, and that those ripples would continue, spreading long after he was gone, touching lives and opening hearts in ways he would never fully understand but could trust were part of God's perfect plan, a plan so beautiful and intricate that it required both the cross on Calvary and visitors from the stars to reveal even a fraction of its glory. It began with questions that came late at night, when the pain medication wore thin, and Iran would lie awake in the makeshift bed Thomas had fashioned from horse blankets and foam, staring at the ceiling with those vast golden eyes that seemed to hold libraries of sorrow. Thomas would sit beside him in the vinyl chair, salvaged from the farmhouse kitchen, reading aloud from the only book that had survived his divorce, the leather-bound Bible his grandmother had given him at confirmation, and Aaron would listen with an intensity that made Thomas self-conscious about his halting pronunciation of the ancient names, his rough voice stumbling over passages he'd never fully understood. But one evening in late summer, when the heat pressed down on the Montana hills and cicadas sang their drowning chorus above ground, Aaron interrupted Thomas mid-verse in the book of Genesis, his hand lifting weakly from the blankets in a gesture that was unmistakably a request to stop, to wait, to listen instead of read. "Your scripture speaks of humanity being made in the image of God," Aaron said, his voice still carrying traces of that musical quality that made every word feel significant. "And this is more true than your teachers ever told you, Thomas, because what you call the soul is not something given to you, but something you are. Consciousness itself shaped by the divine hand and placed in flesh to learn what can only be learned through limitation, through choice, through the experience of separation that makes reunion possible." Thomas set the Bible down on his lap, his calloused fingers still marking the page, feeling that familiar vertigo that came whenever Aaron spoke of things that seemed to contradict everything he'd been taught, and yet somehow rang with a truth his heart recognized before his mind could catch up. "Are you saying we're not from here?" Thomas asked quietly, afraid of the answer, afraid of what it might mean about everything he'd assumed was solid ground beneath his understanding of existence. "I'm saying you're from everywhere and nowhere," Aaron replied, and despite his weakness, there was something almost joyful in his tone. "I'm saying Earth was chosen as a sanctuary for souls who needed a place to grow toward the light, a garden planet seeded by those who serve the highest authority, prepared with such care and precision that every element of your world conspires to teach you about love, about sacrifice, about the choice between self and service that determines the shape of eternity. The implications settled over Thomas like snow, silent and total, covering everything he thought he knew about his place in creation. He stood and paced the small chamber, his work boots scuffing against concrete, trying to process what Iran was suggesting, that humanity wasn't native to this planet, but planted here with intention, that Earth itself was a kind of cosmic school designed by intelligences acting under divine direction, that the random evolutionary story he'd half believed and half ignored in high school might be missing the most important chapter of all. "But the Bible says God created Adam from dust," Thomas protested, not argumentatively, but desperately, needing to understand how the old story and this new revelation could exist in the same universe without one destroying the other. Iran's eyes followed him with patience, with the gentle attention of a teacher who knows the student is close to breakthrough but must arrive there through his own effort. "And so he did," Iran said softly. "Dust of a planet prepared for exactly that purpose, elements forged in stars and gathered here by the Celestial Council. The same council your scriptures call angels and principalities, servants of the one true God who spoke creation into being and continues speaking it into being with every breath you take." Thomas stopped pacing and leaned against the cool concrete wall, his heart hammering in his chest because he could feel the truth of it even as his mind struggled to construct a framework large enough to contain both Genesis and galaxies, both Eden and evolution, both the particular story of one species on one planet and the universal story of consciousness learning to choose love across a cosmos filled with similar gardens, similar chances, similar stakes. "You're telling me God is bigger than we thought," Thomas said finally, and it wasn't really a question, but a surrender. An admission that the container he'd built for the divine had always been too small, too comfortable, too human in its proportions. "I'm telling you that God is exactly what your Jesus revealed," Aaron answered, his voice strengthening as if this truth itself was healing to speak. "Infinite love that manifests as finite mercy, cosmic power that expresses itself through humble service, the force that holds galaxies together, choosing to know you personally, to call you by name, to care about whether one farmer in Montana opens his door to a stranger or closes it, because every such choice sends light or shadow rippling through the web that connects all living things. And the web itself is alive, Thomas, conscious and holy and waiting to see what you will do with your freedom." That night, Thomas dreamed. He stood in a garden that was both Eden and everywhere else, a place where trees grew upward into stars and their roots reached down into darkness that wasn't evil, but simply unformed, pure potential, waiting for the word that would call it into being. He saw humanity there as Iran must see them, not as accidents of chemistry, but as children of God, planted in flesh like seeds in soil, growing slowly toward a harvest that would unite Earth with other redeemed worlds in what Iran had called the communion of light, the cosmic body of Christ extending across dimensions and species, all of it somehow contained in the mystery of a single life given on a Roman cross 2,000 years ago by a being whose true nature was vast enough to hold both humanity and the stars in a love that never wavered, never calculated, never withheld itself, even when rejection and crucifixion were the response. In the dream, Thomas understood that Jesus wasn't God's plan for humans alone, but God's revelation to the entire universe of what the divine character actually is. Perfect love descending into limitation, not as punishment, but as gift, as demonstration, as invitation to every conscious being everywhere to follow that same path of self-emptying that paradoxically leads to fullness beyond measure. He saw the cross, then, not as an isolated event, but as a moment when heaven and earth and all, the worlds between, touched in a single point of infinite significance, when the question every soul in every galaxy must eventually face, whether to love or to grasp, was answered definitively by God himself in the person of a Jewish carpenter who spoke of sparrows and lilies and the kingdom available to anyone humble enough to receive it like a child. When Thomas woke before dawn in his chair beside Aaron's bed, his face was wet with tears he didn't remember crying, and the chamber was filled with a presence he couldn't see, but felt as surely as warmth from a fire, a holiness that didn't demand anything but simply was, existing in the space between him and the alien whose labored breathing was itself a kind of prayer, a participation in the suffering that redeems, the vulnerability that saves, the weakness through which God's strength is most perfectly revealed to those with eyes to see it. Over the following months, as Aaron's health slowly stabilized and his command of language grew more sophisticated, Thomas learned to ask better questions, to listen not just with his ears, but with the part of himself that had been awakened by that first vision of earth wrapped in light. Aaron spoke of the ancient celestial council as beings of such age and wisdom they remembered when the cosmos was young, when the Creator first began the great work of fashioning consciousness from the void and giving it freedom to choose its own direction, knowing that such freedom would inevitably lead some to fall and others to rise, but that the risk was worth it, because love without choice isn't love, but programming. And God desired genuine relationship, genuine communion, genuine family, rather than servants who had no option but obedience. He explained that Earth was one of many such sanctuary worlds, each designed for souls at different stages of development, each offering exactly the right combination of beauty and hardship to teach what needed to be learned, but that Earth was special, uniquely precious, because it had been visited by the divine presence in a way no other world had experienced, had been walked upon by God in flesh, had witnessed the perfect life that showed every other consciousness in creation what they were meant to become, who they were meant to be. Your Jesus changed everything, Aaron said one evening, with such reverence that Thomas felt his throat tighten. Before his life and death and rising, the path to reunion with God was obscured by ritual and law and effort, but he made it simple, made it available to anyone who would accept it, and that message has been spreading through the cosmos ever since, carried by beings like me who heard it and were transformed, who understood that the same love he showed you is offered to all, that the door he opened leads to a home big enough for every soul willing to walk through it, regardless of what planet they were born on or what shape their body takes. Thomas sat in silence after that, holding these truths like precious stones in his rough hands, understanding that his small life in this remote corner of Montana had become a point where heaven touched earth just as surely as it had in Bethlehem, that the same God who sent his son to a stable had sent this wounded messenger to a barn, and that both arrivals were acts of love aimed at people the world considered insignificant, nobodies, forgotten ones, who turned out to be exactly who God preferred to work through, because they had nothing to prove and no reputation to protect, and were therefore free to simply say yes when the impossible came knocking. It was during the coldest weeks of winter, when frost painted intricate cathedrals on the basement windows, and the propane heater struggled against the Montana darkness, that Aaron began to speak of Jesus in ways that made Thomas feel he'd been blind his entire life, reading words without seeing the light behind them. They were sitting, as they always did in those evening hours, Thomas with his Bible open and Aaron propped against pillows Thomas had brought from the house, and the alien's golden eyes seemed to glow with their own luminescence as he spoke. About the being he called the Light of Lights, the Word made flesh, the one who descended from the highest throne in creation to live among humans not as conqueror, but as servant, as brother, as the ultimate revelation of what God actually is beneath all the projections and fears humanity had layered over the divine face. Your people speak of Jesus as if he belonged only to earth, Aaron said, his voice carrying that musical quality that always made Thomas think of wind chimes and distant thunder combined. But Thomas, You must understand that his coming was an event felt across every dimension where consciousness dwells, a moment when the Creator himself stepped into creation in a way that changed the spiritual physics of reality itself, opening a doorway that had been closed since the first rebellion, the first choice to love self above all. Thomas felt his hands trembling as they gripped the Bible, not from cold, but from the weight of what was being offered to him. A vision of Christ that didn't diminish the man from Nazareth, but magnified him beyond anything Thomas had heard from pulpits or Sunday school teachers, revealing him as simultaneously the Jewish carpenter who wept at his friend's tomb and the cosmic Lord whose authority extended to worlds Thomas couldn't name and beings he couldn't imagine. "I always thought he came just for us," Thomas whispered, and there was grief in his voice for the smallness of his previous understanding. "Just to save humans from hell, just to fix what Adam broke in the garden." Aaron reached out then with one of his long-fingered hands and touched Thomas's wrist, and the contact sent a warmth through the farmer's body that felt like comfort and confirmation, intertwined, like being known and loved exactly as he was in all his confusion and inadequacy. "He did come for you," Aaron replied, his touch lingering gentle as a blessing. "But the you he came for is larger than you imagined, because you are not merely bodies that possess souls, but souls who have been given bodies, consciousness shaped by divine intention and placed in flesh to learn what cannot be learned in the pure realms of spirit, where everything is known and nothing must be trusted, where love is easy because there's no cost to it, no risk, no possibility of loss, that makes every choice to love anyway into something precious and eternal." Thomas tried to absorb this, tried to reconcile the idea that his soul existed before his birth with the Christian teaching he'd always assumed meant he was created fresh in his mother's womb. And Aaron seemed to sense the collision happening in his mind because he continued speaking with even greater care, each word chosen as if lives depended on the clarity of what was being communicated. "Your Jesus taught that you must be born again," Aaron said, and this was not metaphor but literal truth, because every soul enters this world having forgotten its origin, forgotten the choice it made to come here and learn through limitation what unlimited beings cannot learn. And his message was the reminder, the call back to remembrance, the invitation to wake up to your true identity as children of the living God who put on flesh like a costume for a little while, but will one day shed it and return home transformed by what you experienced here, by whether you learned to love or refused the lesson. The implications crashed over Thomas like waves, each one pulling him further from shore into deeper water where his feet couldn't touch bottom, and he had to either trust or drown, had to either expand to contain this larger story or reject it to protect the smaller one he'd been living inside without knowing it was a cage. He thought of all the people he'd known who died without faith, including his own father, and the question burst from him unbidden, desperate, needing the answer more than his next breath. What about those who never heard of Jesus, or who heard but couldn't believe, or who died before he came? Are they just lost forever? Is God really that small? Aaron's expression shifted into something that looked almost like relief, as if he'd been waiting for exactly this question, as if Thomas had finally arrived at the heart of why he was here, why this meeting had been arranged by powers beyond either of their choosing. The Jesus who walked your earth in sandals was the visible expression the farmer's faith deepened as Aaron showed him visions of the universe as a living temple, not through screens or devices, but through touch, through placing those long alien fingers against Thomas's forehead while speaking in that language that seemed older than words. And suddenly Thomas wasn't in his basement anymore, but suspended in a darkness so complete it should have terrified him, except that it was filled with a presence that felt like being held, like being known, like coming home after a lifetime of exile. He hadn't realized he was living. Stars began to appear around him, not as distant points of light, but as living things, conscious and singing, each one a note in a symphony so vast and intricate that Thomas understood with sudden clarity why ancient people worshipped the heavens, not because they were ignorant, but because they could still perceive what modern humanity had forgotten, that creation itself is alive, responsive, intentional, every galaxy and nebula a brushstroke in a painting that depicts the nature of the painter. This is what your prophets saw. Aaron's voice came from everywhere and nowhere, resonating in Thomas's chest like a second heartbeat. When they spoke of the heavens, declaring the glory of God, when they described the morning stars singing together, they were not speaking poetry but reporting truth, because the universe is not dead matter obeying blind laws, but a living temple, where consciousness grows and learns and chooses, where planets like yours serve as spiritual classrooms for souls who need the resistance of flesh and time to become what they were always meant to be. Thomas wanted to weep, but had no body to weep with in this state, wanted to fall on his face in worship, but had no face to fall on, so instead he simply opened himself to what was being shown, surrendering the need to understand in favor of the willingness to receive, and that surrender seemed to be exactly what was needed, because the vision deepened, expanded, pulled back, to show him Earth as a blue jewel suspended in the velvet darkness, wrapped in layers of light that he knew somehow were not physical but spiritual, protection and intention woven around the planet like a parent's hands cupped around a candle flame. He saw then what Iran meant about classrooms, saw souls arriving like students on the first day of school, each one choosing their lessons before incarnation, selecting the circumstances that would provide exactly the friction needed to polish away the false self and reveal the true one underneath. And he saw that some lessons required poverty and others wealth, some required health and others sickness, some required long life, and others brief flames that burned bright and went out quickly, and none of it was punishment or randomness, but curriculum, divine education, the universe itself conspiring to produce graduates who had learned through lived experience what could never be taught through instruction alone. Free will, Aaron whispered, and the words rippled through the vision like stones dropped in still water, is the ultimate gift and the ultimate risk, because God could have made you all puppets who never chose wrong, never caused suffering, never rejected love, but then you would never be real, never be capable of true relationship, never be able to offer back to the Creator anything He didn't put there Himself. And so you were made free, genuinely free, and that freedom means you can choose to descend instead of ascend, to close instead of open, to fear instead of love. And the tragedy is that many do, many will, because the classroom is hard and the lessons hurt, and it's easier to blame the teacher than trust the curriculum. Thomas felt something breaking open in his chest, some calcified understanding shattering to reveal raw truth underneath, and he realized he was seeing the answer to every question that had haunted him through decades of lonely faith, every child's death and natural disaster and human cruelty that had made him wonder if God was absent or cruel or simply overwhelmed. And now he saw that all of it, every particle of suffering, was allowed not because God didn't care, but because He cared enough to let the lessons be real, to refuse to stop the class every time a student struggled, to believe in humanity's capacity to eventually choose love, even when given 10,000 chances to choose hate. The vision shifted again, and Thomas saw civilizations rising and falling across the galaxy like flowers blooming and dying in fast forward, some reaching toward the stars with open hands and joining what Iran called the communion of ascending worlds, while others turned inward and consumed themselves in wars over resources and beliefs and the desperate need to prove superiority. And he understood that Earth was balanced on exactly that edge right now, poised between graduation and failure, and that beings like Iran were part of a vast network of watchers and protectors who surrounded developing worlds the way parents hover near children learning to walk. not interfering with the lesson, but preventing catastrophic falls, and that this protection had been in place since the beginning, since the first humans looked up at the stars and wondered if they were alone. "You are not alone," Aaron said, and Thomas felt himself being pulled back into his body, back into the basement with its concrete floor and bare bulb and the smell of propane and dust. "You have never been alone, not for one moment of your existence, because the universe itself is the body of God, and you live inside him the way fish live in the ocean, swimming, in consciousness that sustains and surrounds and loves you with an intensity that would destroy you if you experienced it fully, which is why it comes to you filtered through grace, through mercy, through the gradual revelation that meets you where you are and leads you gently toward where you need to be." Thomas opened his eyes and found he was weeping after all, tears streaming down his weathered face as Iran's hand withdrew from his forehead, and the alien was weeping too in his own way, a luminescence leaking from his eyes like liquid light, and Thomas knew they had shared something sacred, something that bound them as brothers despite the impossible difference of their origins. "The temple is everywhere," Thomas whispered, his voice hoarse with emotion, looking around the basement as if seeing it for the first time, seeing the divine presence saturating even this humble space with its cracked walls and cobwebs and the old furnace that rattled when it ran. "There's nowhere God isn't, is there?" Aaron smiled with that expression. That always seemed too full of sorrow and joy mixed together to belong to one face, and he nodded slowly, deliberately, as if confirming a truth that Thomas had known in his depths, but had never been able to name until this moment, when the naming became possible through the meeting of two beings who should never have met but were brought together by a love that arranged even disasters for redemptive purposes. "There is nowhere he isn't," Aaron agreed, "and that means there is nowhere you can fall that he won't catch you, nowhere you can run that he won't follow, nothing you can do that will stop him from believing you're worth the infinite patience it takes to teach souls how to love, which is the only lesson that matters, the only curriculum that echoes into eternity after all the other knowledge fades away." Thomas thought of the years stretching ahead, decades of hiding his friend while the world searched, decades of isolation and secrecy and lying to neighbors who wondered why he never invited anyone inside anymore. And instead of feeling burdened, he felt chosen, felt honored, felt like he'd been given the privilege of living out the very lessons Iran described, learning through sacrifice and trust what could never be learned through comfort and certainty, and he knew with absolute conviction that he would do it, would protect this messenger even if it cost him everything, because some things are worth the cost, some truths are worth dying to preserve, and love is always, always worth whatever it asks of those who choose to practice it. It was late October of 1997 when Iran finally told Thomas why he'd really been shot down, and the revelation came not in words at first, but in a sudden fever that gripped the alien in the middle of the night, his body temperature spiking so high that Thomas feared the concrete floor might crack beneath him where he'd collapsed, luminescent fluid seeping from wounds that had supposedly healed years ago. And when Thomas pressed cold cloths to that strange skin and whispered desperate prayers, Iran's eyes opened with a look of such profound sorrow that Thomas understood without being told that they had reached some boundary, some point beyond which secrets could no longer be kept, because the cost of keeping them had become greater than the cost of speaking them. The fever broke near dawn, and Iran sat up slowly, painfully, and began to speak in that voice that had grown more human over the years, but still carried harmonics that seemed to resonate in dimensions Thomas couldn't name. And what he said made Thomas's blood run cold, even as his spirit burned with the terrible privilege of hearing it. "I was not running from my people when I crashed, Thomas. I was fighting for yours. And the war I was fighting has been going on since before your species learned to make fire. a war most humans don't know exists, even though it rages in the spaces between spaces, in frequencies your eyes can't see and dimensions your scientists haven't discovered, because there are forces in this universe that do not want humanity to graduate, do not want you to ascend, because a redeemed Earth represents something they fear more than any weapon. Thomas felt his hands begin to shake as he absorbed this, felt the comfortable story he'd constructed over 14 years of hiding. His friend began to crack apart like ice in spring thaw, because one thing was believing you were sheltering a refugee, and another entirely was learning you were harboring a soldier, a warrior who had fought and bled and fallen to protect a world that didn't even know it needed protecting. "What are they afraid of?" Thomas asked, his voice barely above a whisper. And Iran stood despite his obvious weakness and moved to the small window that looked out at ground level onto the Montana fields, now brown and dormant under the approaching winter. And he was silent for so long that Thomas thought perhaps the question wouldn't be answered. But then the alien turned back, and his eyes were full of that liquid light again, tears or something like them, and he said, "They are afraid of love, Thomas, which sounds absurd until you understand that love is the most powerful force in creation, the only thing that can transform darkness from the inside out rather than merely suppressing it from the outside in, and humanity, for all its failures and violence and stupidity, has a capacity for love that terrifies the ancient powers who built their empires on fear and control. Because you are so young, so raw, so close to the animal that you can still choose freely in ways older races forgot how to choose millennia ago. And if you choose love, if Earth becomes a civilization built on the principles your Jesus taught, you won't just join the communion of ascending worlds, you'll revolutionize it. Because you'll bring a passion and authenticity that comes from having climbed out of such deep darkness into such brilliant light. Thomas thought of every sermon he'd ever heard about spiritual warfare, about principalities and powers, and the battles that rage in heavenly places, and suddenly those ancient words weren't metaphors anymore, but journalism, reports from the front lines of a conflict so vast that human language could barely contain it. And he understood with crystalline clarity why the enemy had always worked so hard to corrupt the church, to turn religion into a weapon of division and judgment and control. Because a Christianity that actually practiced Christ's teaching of radical love would be more dangerous to the powers of darkness than any army or empire could ever be. "You were defending us," Thomas said slowly, piecing it together, remembering the news reports from 1983 about unusual atmospheric phenomena over the northern United States, about military installations going on high alert for reasons never fully explained, about a week when the world seemed to hold its breath without knowing why. There was something trying to get through, something trying to reach Earth, and you stopped it. Aaron nodded, and Thomas saw in that gesture the weight of what it had cost, saw that this being who had given up 14 years to hiding in a basement had given up far more before that, had sacrificed position and home, and perhaps even the chance to return to whatever family or people waited for him somewhere among the stars, all to protect a planet full of strangers who would likely kill him if they knew he existed. And the sheer absurdity of that sacrifice, the ridiculous, illogical beauty of it, made Thomas laugh even as tears ran down his face, because he recognized the pattern, saw that Aaron was living out the same principle Christ had demonstrated, that the shepherd really does leave the 99 to save the one, that love really does give itself away without counting the cost, and that this truth was apparently woven so deeply into the fabric of reality that even aliens from distant stars couldn't help but embody it when they chose to align themselves with the light. "There are others like you," Thomas said, and it wasn't a question, but a statement, a certainty rising from somewhere deeper than logic. Others who watch over us, who fight battles we never see, who believe we're worth protecting, even when all the evidence suggests we're determined to destroy ourselves. Aaron smiled, and it was the saddest, most hopeful expression Thomas had ever seen on any face, human or otherwise, and he said simply, "Yes, and we believe because he believes, because the one who made you hasn't given up on you, and if God himself still has faith in humanity's capacity to choose love, then who are we to despair, we who are merely his servants, his hands and eyes and voices in a universe that needs constant reminding that the light is stronger than the darkness, even when the darkness seems to be winning, especially then." Thomas felt something settle in his bones in that moment, a conviction that would carry him through the lonely years still ahead, through the decades of isolation and the gradual aging that would come while Eran aged too in his own strange way. And he understood finally why he'd been chosen for this, why the crash had happened over his land, and why he'd been the one to find the survivor. Because he had the capacity to believe in purposes larger than himself, to trust in plans he couldn't see, to love without needing to understand, and those qualities were rare enough and precious enough that the universe itself had bent probability to bring him to this basement, to this moment, to this alien warrior who wept tears of light while speaking of battles fought in humanity's defense, and Thomas knew with absolute certainty that he would honor this trust, would keep this secret and protect this friend until the very end. Because some gifts are so sacred that the only appropriate response is complete surrender, and he had been given the gift of knowing that Earth was loved not just by its creator, but by beings who crossed the stars to defend it, and that knowledge changed everything, made every morning a miracle, and every sunset a promise that the light would return no matter how dark the night became. It was the winter of 2019 when Eran began to speak of his own death with a certainty that chilled Thomas more than any Montana blizzard could, his voice carrying that peculiar weight that comes when someone discusses not a possibility, but an approaching fact. And Thomas, who was 73 years old by then, and feeling every year in his arthritic joints and failing eyesight, wanted to protest, wanted to rage against the unfairness of losing the only friend who had truly understood the strange shape his life had taken. But Eran stopped him with a gesture that was both gentle and final, explaining that his body had always been on borrowed time in Earth's atmosphere, that the biology that allowed him to breathe oxygen and metabolize human food had been failing gradually for years, and that he had perhaps another summer, perhaps less, before the systems that sustained him would simply stop. Thomas felt something break inside his chest as he absorbed this news, felt 36 years of companionship crystallizing into something precious and finite. Every conversation suddenly weighted with the knowledge that there would be a last. Every shared meal a countdown, and he found himself weeping not just for the coming loss, but for all the lost years. All the dinners Eran had never shared above ground, all the sunrises he'd never seen except through that one small window, all the life Thomas's fear had stolen from both of them, even as it had kept Eran safe. But Eran reached out with those long fingers that had grown familiar as family and touched Thomas's face with a tenderness that transcended species, and he said something that changed grief into purpose, fear into hope, loneliness into legacy. "My death will not be an ending, Thomas, but a beginning, because my body is encoded with a signal that will activate when my heart stops, a beacon that will reach beyond this solar system to my people, to those who have waited and watched and prayed for the day when Earth would be ready for open contact. And they will come, Thomas, not to invade or conquer, but to embrace, to welcome you into the greater family you were always meant to join." Thomas struggled to comprehend what he was hearing, his mind reeling with implications that stretched from the intensely personal to the cosmically vast, because Eran was saying that his death would trigger not just mourning, but first contact, that the loss Thomas dreaded would become the catalyst for humanity's greatest transformation, and the responsibility of that Knowledge felt crushing, the weight of keeping this secret not just from neighbors anymore, but from the entire human race. Because what right did one old farmer have to know the future before presidents and scientists and all the brilliant minds who studied the stars? Yet here he was again, chosen for reasons he couldn't fathom, to be the keeper of truths that would reshape civilization. "How will they know we're ready?" Thomas asked, his voice rough with emotion. And Iran settled himself on the old couch that had become his bed in recent years, his luminescence dimmer than it had been in decades past. His movements slower, but somehow more deliberate, as if each gesture now carried the weight of teaching, of passing on wisdom while time remained. And he explained that readiness wasn't about technology or political unity or any of the metrics humans usually applied to progress, but about something far simpler and infinitely harder. The capacity to choose love over fear when confronted with the truly other, the truly strange, the truly different. "My people have watched your species for thousands of years," Iran continued, his voice taking on that resonance that made the air itself seem to vibrate with meaning. "And they have seen you at your worst and your best, seen you murder each other over differences of skin and belief and geography, but also seen you risk everything to save strangers, seen you create beauty for no other reason than joy, seen you love with a ferocity that makes the stars themselves seem cold by comparison. And they believe, Thomas, they believe that you are capable of choosing unity, that the message Jesus brought is taking root slowly, painfully across your world, and that when you see my people descending from the sky, you will remember that the God you worship is big enough to love more than one planet, generous enough to fill a universe with children, and that we are all family in the deepest sense, all brothers and sisters learning together how to become what love intends." Thomas thought of the Bible he'd read every morning for 50 years, thought of passages that spoke of many mansions and sheep not of this fold, thought of Jesus telling his disciples that he had other things to teach them, but they weren't ready yet. And suddenly those cryptic statements bloomed with new meaning, because what if the gospel had always been larger than earth? What if the redemption purchased on Calvary had implications that rippled across galaxies? What if the Christian story wasn't humanity's private myth, but a local chapter in a cosmic epic of fall and restoration that played out on worlds whose names he'd never know? And the sheer scale of that vision should have made him feel insignificant, but instead made him feel held, convinced him that a God who could orchestrate salvation across such distances must care about every detail, every sparrow, every hidden alien, in every dark basement, on every backwater planet, struggling toward the light. "You're telling me," Thomas said slowly, working through the implications, "that when you die and they come, it won't be an invasion but an invitation, that humanity will have a choice to make, that we can join you among the stars, but only if we prove we've learned what Jesus tried to teach us, only if we show that we're capable of the kind of love that crosses boundaries instead of building them." Aaron nodded, and Thomas saw tears, actual tears, running down that strange face, saw emotion that was unmistakably grief and hope mixed together, and the alien said, "I have given my life to protect your chance at this choice, Thomas, and I will give my death to initiate it. And I tell you this now, because you must prepare, must write down what I've shared so that when they find this place after I'm gone, when government agents break down your doors and discover this chamber, they will also discover the truth. They will read your journal and know that I was not an invader, but a guardian. And perhaps that knowledge will soften enough hearts that humanity chooses welcome over warfare, love over fear, and steps at last into the destiny that has been waiting since before your ancestors climbed down from the trees." The years that followed were simultaneously the slowest and fastest of Thomas's life, each day precious and painful as he watched his friend deteriorate with the inevitability of seasons turning, Iran's luminescence fading to a gentle glow, his movements becoming labored, his breathing shallow, yet his spirit somehow growing brighter as his body dimmed, as if the approaching death was refining him, burning away everything inessential until only love remained, pure and fierce and absolutely certain. Thomas wrote everything in the journal Iran had given him years ago, page after page of testimony and teaching, recording. Not just facts, but feelings. Not just Iran's words, but his own transformation from frightened farmer to willing witness, and he built the sealed chamber deeper in the basement with Iran's guidance, installing the alien technology that would preserve the journal and Iran's body and the seed device that contained his final message to humanity. Understanding that he was constructing not a tomb, but a time capsule, a gift box wrapped in concrete and faith, and the desperate hope that people would choose wisely when the moment came. Iran died on a spring morning when the Montana fields were just beginning to green, died peacefully in Thomas's arms, whispering that he could see them coming, could see the ships already beginning their journey toward Earth, could see a future where human children and alien children played together under foreign suns, while their parents built civilizations based on the radical principle that love was not weakness, but the strongest force in creation. And Thomas held him as the light faded from his eyes and felt the signal pulse outward, felt something shift in the fabric of reality as the beacon activated and began its journey across the stars, carrying news that one guardian had fallen, but his hope remained, his faith intact, his love for humanity unshaken despite everything. And Thomas knew that now all he could do was wait for his own death, which came 3 years later, wait for the discovery which happened exactly as Iran had predicted, wait for humanity to make the choice that would determine whether the last 39 years of hiding and sacrifice had been seeds planted in good soil or pearls cast before those who couldn't recognize their value. And he died believing in the former, trusting that God's plan was bigger than his doubts, and that morning would come no matter how long the night. The chamber was discovered on a Thursday afternoon in late October, when federal agents finally broke through the false floor beneath Thomas Garrett's barn, 3 months after neighbors had found the old farmer dead in his bed, with a peaceful expression that suggested dreams rather than endings. And what they found in that underground room defied every protocol and assumption they'd brought with them. Because there, among banks of technology that pulsed with soft bioluminescence, lay a body that was clearly not human, preserved in some kind of stasis field that made the air shimmer like heat rising from summer asphalt, and beside it sat dozens of leather journals stacked with careful precision, their pages filled with handwriting that grew shakier with the years, but never less certain, never less devoted to recording the impossible friendship that had unfolded in secrecy, while the world above went about its ordinary business of living and dying, and never suspecting that in one Montana basement, the future of the species was being quietly prepared. Dr. Sarah Chen was the xenobiologist they brought in first, a woman whose entire career had been built on the theoretical possibility of extraterrestrial life, and she stood in that chamber with tears streaming down her face as theory became flesh, as decades of peer-reviewed caution dissolved before the reality of those elegant limbs, that elongated skull, those hands that even in death seemed poised to offer blessing or comfort. And she found herself whispering prayers she'd learned as a child in her grandmother's Buddhist temple. Prayers she hadn't spoken in 20 years, because somehow in the presence of this being from beyond Earth, she felt closer to the sacred than she ever had in any laboratory, felt that the boundary between science and spirituality was perhaps thinner than her education had taught her to believe, felt that she was standing in a space where the questions that drove her research and the questions that haunted her at midnight were finally, miraculously, revealed to be the same question asked in different languages. The journals were read first by military intelligence officers who were trained to detect deception and conspiracy, read with skepticism that slowly transformed into something like wonder as Thomas's voice emerged from the pages, raw and honest, and completely uninterested in convincing anyone of anything, simply bearing witness to what he'd experienced, to conversations that ranged from the mundane details of cooking human food for an alien digestive system to profound theological discussions about the nature of Christ's sacrifice and whether redemption was a universal constant or a culturally specific metaphor. And the officers found themselves returning to certain passages late at night, reading by flashlight in their temporary quarters, reading about an old farmer who'd chosen compassion over fear, and about an alien who'd spoken of Jesus with a reverence that made their own. Childhood Sunday school lessons suddenly seem urgent and alive and desperately relevant to questions they'd thought religion had no business addressing. But it was the seed device that changed everything, that took the discovery from classified military secret to global revelation. Because on the 13th day of examination, Dr. Chen noticed that the small crystalline object Iran had called his final gift was responding to human presence, warming slightly whenever someone approached, pulsing with light that seemed almost eager, almost impatient. And when she finally touched it with bare hands against every safety protocol her training demanded, it opened like a flower, like a hand, unclenching. And suddenly the chamber was filled with light and sound and the unmistakable sense of a presence, of someone speaking across the gulf of death with a message that had waited years for exactly this moment, for exactly these witnesses, for exactly this threshold in human history when belief and unbelief stood balanced on a knife's edge. And the slightest weight could tip the scales toward either transformation or tragedy. The hologram that emerged was not quite Aaron as he'd appeared in life, but something more, something that suggested the body Thomas had known was only a shell containing light that death had released rather than extinguished, and the message he'd recorded spoke, in dozens of languages simultaneously, spoke directly to each listener in the tongue of their childhood, in the voice of comfort and challenge combined, and he told them what he'd told Thomas in those final years, told them that humanity was not alone and never had been, that Earth was watched and loved and protected by forces that served the same God Christians worshipped, the same ultimate reality Buddhists sought, the same source Muslims submitted to, the same presence Jews had called the name too holy to speak, and that the divisions humans had died for across millennia were tragic misunderstandings of a truth vast enough to hold all seekers, a love patient enough to meet each soul. Where it stood and led it gently toward the light. He told them that his people would come when 1 year had passed, from the moment this message was received, would come to the coordinates he provided in the Nevada desert, where decades ago the government had searched for his crashed ship, would come not as conquerors but as kin, as fellow children of the God who had scattered life across the cosmos, like seeds scattered by a generous farmer, and that humanity faced now the choice every species eventually faces, the choice between fear that builds walls and love that builds bridges, between the isolation of suspicion and the risk of trust, between remaining safe and small and familiar or accepting the invitation to grow, to stretch, to become part of something so much larger than one planet's anxieties and ancient grievances. The recording showed them visions as Iran spoke, showed them Earth as seen from distant observation posts, showed them human history as a long, painful birth, showed them wars and atrocities, but also showed them hospitals and schools, and parents holding children, and strangers pulling strangers from floodwaters, and musicians playing for no audience but joy, and scientists pursuing truth with monastic devotion, and mystics of every tradition, touching the same infinite presence and naming it differently, but loving it identically, showed them that every act of genuine compassion had echoed beyond the atmosphere, had been noted and celebrated by watchers who saw in such moments evidence that this angry, confused, wounded species was nevertheless capable of the very thing that held the universe together, the force that Iran's people called the coherence, and that Jesus had called simply love, the gravity of the spirit that drew all things back toward their source, back toward the heart of God that beat in every sun and whispered in every conscience and blazed in every moment of self-sacrifice. And the agents and scientists watching felt their own hearts breaking open, felt years of cynicism cracking like ice under spring sun, felt themselves weeping not from grief, but from relief, from the sudden devastating hope that perhaps the world was not meaningless chaos, perhaps their lives were not cosmic accidents, perhaps the longing they'd always felt for something more, something truer, something that made sense of suffering and death and the terrible beauty of existence. Perhaps that longing was not delusion but memory, not wishful thinking but recognition, the soul remembering what it had always known, but the noise of living had drowned out. Iran's final words in the message were addressed not to governments or institutions, but to individuals, to every person who would eventually see this recording. And he spoke with the intimacy of a friend, with the authority of one who had died and crossed some threshold that gave him the right to speak plainly. And he said, "You are loved, more than you know, more than you can imagine. Loved not despite your failures, but through them. Loved not for what you achieve, but for what you are. Children of the same God, I serve siblings I have crossed stars to protect, and I tell you that the fear you feel at the thought of our arrival is understandable but unnecessary, because we come not to judge, but to embrace, not to conquer, but to share, not to take, but to give you the gift Thomas gave me, the gift of welcome, of home, of family that transcends every boundary. You thought was absolute, and all we ask is that you choose love when we arrive, choose curiosity over suspicion, choose the better angels of your nature over the demons of your history, and trust that the God who made you made us too, and loves us both with a passion that will not rest until every lost sheep on every world, in every corner of creation, has found its way home. The message ended with coordinates and a date, simple, practical details that somehow made the cosmic intimate, made the impossible real. And Dr. Chen stood in the sudden silence of the chamber, with the seed device cooling in her hands, and knew that nothing would ever be the same, knew that the world above was about to learn what she'd just learned, knew that the journals would be published, and the recording would be broadcast, and humanity would spend the next 12 months in an agony of preparation and argument and soul-searching. And she found herself praying again, praying to the God she'd half believed in and half dismissed, praying that Thomas Garrett's faith had not been misplaced, that Erin's people would indeed come in peace, that the choice he'd described was truly available and not some cruel test humanity was destined to fail. And as she prayed, she felt something she'd never felt in any laboratory, felt a presence that was not the hologram, but something older and closer and infinitely patient, felt what Thomas must have felt in that basement over decades of doubt and wonder, felt the absolute certainty that whatever else was true, love was the deepest truth, the final truth, the truth that would outlast stars and species and every empire built on lesser foundations. And that truth was enough, was more than enough, was everything. The message reached the world on a Monday morning in early November, when governments could no longer justify keeping it secret, when the sheer number of witnesses and leaked fragments made containment impossible, and within hours of the official broadcast, humanity stopped, simply stopped, as 8 billion people watched Iran's holographic form speak of love and reunion, and the choice that now lay before them like an open door. In Tokyo, a businessman wept on the subway platform, and no one mocked him because they were weeping too. In São Paulo, a gang member put down his gun and walked out of the favela toward a church he hadn't entered since childhood. In Moscow, an old Woman crossed herself and whispered that she'd always known the stars were full of God's children. In Lagos Street, preachers and imams stood side by side, reading Thomas Garrett's journals on mobile phones, and marveling at how this simple farmer had understood what seminaries and madrasas had struggled for centuries to articulate. The debates began. Immediately, of course, the talk shows and emergency sessions of Parliament and theological councils convened to determine if this was divine revelation or demonic deception. But beneath the institutional arguing, something else was happening, something quieter and more powerful, a movement that had no leaders and needed none, because it emerged. From the same place prayer emerges, from the silent places in human hearts where hope lives, even when circumstances provide no rational justification for its survival. People began gathering at night to watch the stars, not in organized vigils, but in spontaneous communion, standing in fields and on rooftops and in parking lots, with faces turned upward. And they weren't watching for Aaron's people exactly, but for something larger, for confirmation that the universe was what the message claimed it was, a temple rather than a void, a home rather than an exile. And in those gatherings, strangers spoke to strangers with unusual gentleness, shared coffee and blankets and stories of what the message had stirred in them, what fears it had surfaced and what ancient hungers it had fed. The farmer's name became a benediction, became shorthand for the kind of courage humanity would need in the year ahead, and people made pilgrimages to Montana to stand before the barn where Thomas Garrett had chosen compassion over self-preservation, had bet his entire life on the possibility that love was stronger than fear, and they left flowers and handwritten notes and small stones stacked into cairns that the wind would eventually scatter, but that nevertheless testified to something the heart knew, even when the mind doubted. Theologians who had spent careers in careful disagreement found themselves in unprecedented dialogue, Christian scholars sitting with Buddhist monks and Muslim imams and Jewish rabbis and Hindu priests, not to debate doctrine, but to marvel at how Iran's words had somehow honored all their traditions while transcending the boundaries each had thought were sacred. And in those conversations they began to glimpse what Thomas had seen in his basement discussions, that the God they served was so much vaster than any single tradition could contain, so much more generous than their exclusive claims had suggested, and that recognizing this vastness didn't diminish their faith but fulfilled it, didn't betray their ancestors but honored what their ancestors had truly been seeking beneath the cultural particulars of their seeking. Universities established departments of xenotheology overnight, scientists and mystics collaborating on questions that had been relegated to philosophy or fantasy, but now demanded rigorous attention, questions about whether consciousness was itself a kind of universal constant, like gravity, whether love was indeed the force Iran had described, whether the longing for transcendence that every human culture had expressed was actually racial memory of the cosmic family they'd been separated from. And the research was urgent but not frantic, grounded in a strange new patience that the message had seeded, a sense that they had time, that whatever was coming in 1 year was not a deadline but a doorway, not a test to pass or fail, but an invitation to become what they'd always had the potential to become. The movements that emerged were as diverse as humanity itself, some groups focusing on environmental restoration as a way of preparing Earth for visitors who might judge them by how they'd treated the garden they'd been given. Others organizing peace initiatives in war zones, because how could they welcome beings who spoke of love while still slaughtering each other over borders and resources and ancient grudges? Still others simply gathering to pray in the old ways, but with new understanding, rosaries and prayer beads and meditation cushions employed in the service of a vision that was both utterly familiar and shockingly expanded. The same God they'd always worshipped but revealed now as the God of 1,000,000,000,000 worlds. The same Christ they'd always loved but understood now as a manifestation of light that perhaps had appeared on other planets in other forms. The same journey toward enlightenment, but mapped now across galactic distances and multiple species, all stumbling toward the same summit from different paths up the mountain. There were resistors too, of course, those who saw the message as deception or threat, who armed themselves and built bunkers and declared that humanity should meet the visitors with weapons rather than welcome. But even they could not quite escape the hope that infected even fear, could not quite silence the small voice that whispered that maybe, just maybe, Thomas Garrett had been right, that maybe the risk of trust was worth taking, that maybe they were tired of being afraid and ready for something different, even if different meant vulnerable, meant uncertain, meant standing under the stars with empty hands and open hearts and praying that the universe would be kind. And through it all, Dr. Chen became the face of scientific wonder, the woman who appeared on every news program to explain the technology they'd found and the biology of Iran's preserved body, but who also spoke with unusual candor about the way the discovery had shattered her materialist assumptions, had returned her to prayers she'd thought she'd outgrown, and her honesty gave permission to millions of others to admit their own confusion and hope, to say that they didn't understand everything, but they felt something. Felt that perhaps the boundary between the sacred and the scientific had always been an illusion, that perhaps God had been present in every laboratory and observatory and particle accelerator, present in the questions themselves, present in the hunger to understand that drove both mystics and physicists toward the same ultimate mystery, the night. Before the one-year anniversary arrived, the world held its breath, held a global silence that had been organized through social media and text chains and whispered agreements, a moment when as many humans as possible would simply stop and listen and open themselves to whatever was coming. And in that silence, people felt it, felt something vast and gentle moving through the collective consciousness of the species, felt what Thomas must have felt when Iran first looked at him with those huge eyes full of trust and need, felt the choice as a physical sensation in their chests, the choice between closing and opening, between retreating and advancing, between the familiar hell of isolation and the terrifying heaven of connection. And 8 billion hearts beat in approximate unison for one moment that would be remembered by survivors for generations, beat out a rhythm that was both prayer and answer, both question and declaration. And the message they sent into the night without words was simply yes, was simply please, was simply we are ready, or if not ready, then willing. And if not willing, then desperate, desperate for the love Iran had promised, desperate for the family Thomas had died believing in, desperate for the God who had made them to prove that the making had been purposeful and the purpose had been love, only and always love, and nothing else worth crossing the stars for, or living a human life for, or building a universe vast enough to contain every possible soul searching for home. And in the Nevada desert, where dawn broke first across the American continent, where military and civilian observers had gathered at the coordinates, where cameras from every nation pointed at empty sky, the waiting began, and it was not anxious waiting but expectant, not dread but hope, and in that hope was every prayer ever prayed and every kindness ever shown, and every moment any human had ever chosen love over fear, and the choice itself, the simple human choice to stand there with faces upturned and hearts open, was already the beginning of the transformation Iran had died to make possible, was already the answer to the question Thomas had spent 40 years living in that Montana basement, was already proof that this angry, wounded, beautiful species was ready not because they were perfect, but because they were finally willing to admit they didn't have to be, willing to be loved as they were, willing to let that love change them into what they'd always been meant to become. What do you believe humanity would truly choose if the stars opened tomorrow? Subscribe to witness more stories where faith and the cosmos collide.